4 feet in diameter. That is the total amount of space you have. Your knees are pulled against your chest. Your chin is inches from the gun sight mounted between your legs. There is no room to extend your arms. There is no room to shift your weight from one side to the other. And somewhere above you, separated from you by the curved aluminum skin of the fuselage, 9 other men are going about their jobs on a bomber, flying at 25,000 feet over Germany, with fighters coming up from below. The aircraft goes down. If the pilot of the aircraft goes down, if the pilot gives the bailout order, you will need to exit this turret, locate and put on your parachute inside a burning or disintegrating aircraft, and then jump. Under ideal conditions, that process takes at least 2 minutes and requires help from another crew member. Conditions on a bomber under attack over Germany in 1943 were rarely ideal. Drop a 1 in the comments if you had no idea ball turret gunners couldn't carry their parachute. Drop a 2 if you already knew this. Let's see how many people knew the full picture. The Sperry ball turret was not part of the original B-17 design. Early B-17 models used a remotely operated belly gun, complex, mechanically unreliable, and essentially useless in actual combat conditions. Beginning with the B-17E variant, Boeing engineers bolted a spherical, manned turret to the underside of the fuselage. The engineering solution was genuinely impressive. The turret could rotate a full 360 degrees and pitch downward 90 degrees, giving the gunner inside complete coverage of everything below and around the aircraft's belly. It was the most comprehensive field of fire of any position on the bomber. From a human standpoint, it was a different kind of achievement entirely. The entry requirement alone filtered out most of the bomber crew. The turret was 4 feet in diameter. To occupy it operationally, a man generally needed to be under 5 feet 6 inches tall and weigh less than 150 pounds. Even men who met both criteria found the entry process, backing through a hatch while the turret was manually rotated to align the opening, curling into the fetal position inside, pulling the hatch closed behind you, demanding and claustrophobic. The entry and exit procedure was never performed during takeoff or landing. The mechanical and practical risks of having a man sealed in the belly turret during a runway emergency, with no rapid exit path, were considered unacceptable. The gunner climbed in once the aircraft was airborne and climbed out before landing, assuming all turret systems were functional when it came time to exit. The history of what these men actually went through in the air, in that turret, over enemy territory, is exactly the kind of story this channel is built around. Subscribe if you want more of it. Once sealed inside and the aircraft reached operational altitude, the temperature became the first sustained physical trial. B-17 missions over Germany typically flew between 20,000 and 30,000 feet. At those altitudes, outside temperatures dropped to -50 or 60 degrees Celsius. The turret was electrically heated, but the heating system was chronically underpowered for those conditions. Gunners wore electrically heated flight suits, gloves, and boots. None of it was sufficient. The cold worked its way through the suit and through the body with patience that mechanical systems could not match. Breath condensed and froze on the interior of the plexiglass viewport, progressively restricting visibility. Ice formed on the optical components of the gun sight. Gunners' hands, even inside the heated gloves, eventually lost sensation in the fingers, which created a specific operational problem. The only way to confirm you were still gripping the gun controls was to look down and check. The feedback that the hands were supposed to provide had stopped arriving. On missions lasting 8 to 10 hours, the longer-range targets deep into Germany or the Reich required exactly these durations. Some gunners lost meaningful motor function in their extremities well before the aircraft reached the target. At the end of several documented missions, gunners had to be physically extracted from the turret by other crew members. Their muscles, seized by sustained cold in a space that allowed no movement, had locked them in position. They were carried, not walked, to the rear of the aircraft. Beyond the cold, there was the isolation. The turret's physical position, mounted below the fuselage, separated from the main aircraft body by the turret mechanism and its housing, meant that the ball turret gunner had no direct line of sight to any other crew member. The intercom was the only connection. On a routine flight, with the intercom functioning and the crew maintaining communication, this was manageable. During combat, it was not. Enemy fire, electrical damage from flak hits, and the mechanical disruption of sustained combat frequently severed intercom connections without warning. When that happened, the ball turret gunner was operating in complete isolation, unable to communicate, unable to see any other crew member, unable to know the state of the aircraft he was hanging beneath. The position's geometry made it the most exposed point on the entire aircraft. German fighter pilots and anti-aircraft battery crews operating below the bomber streams understood this. Attacks from below put the fighter directly in line with the ball turret and in the optimal attack angle for the aircraft's most vulnerable areas. Every burst of flak rising from ground positions below passed through the space the ball turret occupied. The turret's construction, aluminum frame and plexiglass panels, offered no meaningful protection against 20mm cannon rounds or flak fragments. A direct hit went straight through. Gunners described the sound of rounds striking the turret as a series of sharp cracks, audible even over the engine noise and their own gunfire. Some described feeling the physical vibration of each impact transmitted through the metal beneath them. Flak fragments punching through the turret skin left holes that immediately admitted outside air. At altitude, in those temperatures, even small holes dropped the interior temperature rapidly. Gunners already struggling with cold found their environment becoming actively life-threatening through multiple small penetrations that individually were survivable, but collectively created conditions approaching exposure. Here is the scenario that veterans who flew in B-17 described as the one that haunted them longest after the war. A flak burst or fighter cannon round strikes the turret mechanism, the electric motor, the hydraulic lines, or the mechanical drive components that allow the turret to rotate and be positioned. A solid hit to any of these components can freeze the turret in whatever position it occupies at the moment of impact. It cannot rotate, it cannot pitch, and most critically, it cannot be oriented to the specific position, hatch facing inward toward the fuselage, that allows the escape hatch to be opened and the gunner to exit. The gunner is now sealed inside a non-functioning turret. The crew above cannot reach him. The turret cannot be manually repositioned from inside the aircraft without the functioning mechanism. The gunner can communicate on the intercom if it still works, and that communication amounts to reporting his own situation to people who have no ability to help him. This was not a theoretical failure scenario. Combat damage of this nature was common on missions over heavily defended targets. The Luftwaffe was skilled and aggressive, and anti-aircraft artillery over the Reich's industrial targets was dense enough to make evasion effectively impossible. Electrical and hydraulic damage to the turret mechanism occurred on a meaningful percentage of combat missions. When it did, the crew above and the gunner below faced a specific and terrible situation with no reliable solution. The parachute problem compounded everything. The ball turret gunner's chute was stored inside the fuselage beside the entry hatch. To use it, the gunner needed to exit the turret, retrieve the chute, put it on, and reach an exit point. This sequence, under the best possible conditions, with a fully functional turret and a stable level aircraft, took a minimum of 2 to 3 minutes and required at least one other crew member to assist with the exit. If the turret mechanism was damaged and the hatch could not be aligned for opening, the sequence could not begin at all. The pilot of a B-17 going down faced an explicit and excruciating calculation. Every second he kept the aircraft level and stable while losing altitude was a second that might allow his ball turret gunner to complete the exit sequence. Every one of those seconds also reduced the time available for the pilot himself and the rest of the crew to get out. Some pilots held the aircraft as long as they could. Some of those pilots did not make it out. Their decisions, documented in crew statements and after-action reports, were made with full awareness of the trade-off they were accepting. The belly landing scenario was in some ways the most mechanically straightforward and psychologically devastating of the failure modes. When a B-17's landing gear was shot out or otherwise non-functional, bringing the aircraft down on its belly was the only option. Standard procedure required retracting the ball turret into the fuselage before landing to prevent it from being crushed on contact with the runway. Retraction required a functioning turret mechanism. If the mechanism was damaged, if, precisely, the scenario that had trapped the gunner inside was the same scenario that had disabled the retraction system, the turret would be the first point of contact with the ground at landing speeds above 100 miles per hour. Fellow crew members who survive belly landings with a trapped ball turret gunner give accounts that share specific language across multiple sources. They describe hearing the turret being destroyed on impact, a grinding, tearing sound that lasted for less than a second and communicated, with complete clarity, what had just happened to the man they had been talking to on the intercom moments before. The men who occupied the ball turret knew all of this before they ever climbed in for the first time. The mechanical vulnerabilities were not classified. The absence of the parachute was not a surprise. The cold and the isolation and the exposure to attack from below were simply the conditions of the position. They knew it and they did it anyway, mission after mission, over the Ruhr, over Berlin, over the refineries and rail yards and industrial complexes that the 8th Air Force was systematically trying to remove from the German war economy. They did it because the 2.50 caliber machine guns in the ball turret were genuinely important. Removing or degrading the belly defensive coverage of a B-17 increased the vulnerability of the entire aircraft and every man on it to fighter attacks from below. The ball turret gunner's presence protected the other 9 men on the crew in a direct and documented way. The calculation he was making, his life, continuously at elevated risk, in exchange for reduced risk to the men above him, was understood by everyone involved. The psychological toll of occupying that position, mission after mission, accumulated in ways that the debriefs and the after-action reports did not fully capture. Watching enemy fighters line up below you, seeing the gun flash of their weapons from close enough to distinguish individual muzzle blasts, knowing that you cannot move, cannot take cover, cannot do anything but keep shooting and hope that your fire lands before theirs does. That specific experience, sustained over enough missions, left marks that men spent decades trying to find language for. The ones who came home mostly did not talk about the turret, not in detail, not voluntarily. What they described, when they described anything, was the cold. The broader statistics of ball turret gunner casualties within the 8th Air Force were kept, but not widely publicized during the war, for reasons that were obvious to anyone who thought about recruitment. The position carried one of the highest casualty rates of any crew assignment on the heavy bombers. A combination of the turret's physical exposure, the mechanical failure risks that had no reliable solution, and the absence of the parachute that made a certain category of aircraft emergency fatal for the ball turret gunner, regardless of what any other crew member survived. The gunners who completed their tour, 25 missions was the original standard, later revised upward to 35, did so with a statistical awareness that most of them did not discuss openly, but that shaped every aspect of how they processed the experience. Each completed mission represented one more data point against the probability curve. Each new mission represented another pass through a set of risks that did not diminish with familiarity. Combat veterans of ground campaigns sometimes describe their experience in terms of learning to manage fear through familiarity, the idea that exposure to danger over enough repetitions produced a kind of operational numbness that allowed functioning under conditions that would have been incapacitating earlier in a deployment. Ball turret gunners describe something different. The specific mechanical vulnerabilities of their position, the turret jam, the parachute stored on the other side of a potentially unopenable hatch, were not risks that familiarity diminished. They were risks that familiarity made more vivid. The gunner who had completed 15 missions had 15 data points on exactly how those failures manifested, exactly how quickly they developed, exactly what the intercom traffic between crew members sounded like when the situation was developing in the wrong direction. Knowledge of the specific mechanisms of the worst outcomes did not produce calm. It produced a very detailed imagination. Post-war psychological assessment of heavy bomber veterans identified ball turret gunners as among the crew positions with the highest rates of sustained anxiety disorders and sleep disruption in the years following discharge. The The specific presentation differed from the more commonly recognized combat stress responses associated with infantry experience. It was quieter, less dramatic, and slower to be identified as connected to the war at all. Men who had not been wounded, had not lost crew members to visible combat action, found themselves unable to account for what they were experiencing in terms that made sense to them, or to the medical professionals they occasionally consulted. What they were carrying was the accumulated weight of a specific and unusual form of sustained mortal vulnerability. The knowledge, held across dozens of missions, that a particular category of mechanical failure would kill them in a particular way with no available countermeasure. That knowledge does not leave cleanly. It embeds itself and changes the texture of how a person experiences enclosed spaces, mechanical sounds, the sensation of cold, and a long list of ordinary sensory inputs that the nervous system had, over the course of a combat tour, learned to associate with genuine danger. The Sperry Ball turret remained in service on B-17 and B-24s throughout the strategic bombing campaign in Europe and the Pacific. The design was not changed in the ways that might have addressed the core vulnerabilities. The parachute storage problem was never resolved. The mechanical failure modes that could trap a gunner remained present throughout the war. The operational requirement for belly coverage was real, and the turret provided it effectively. The cost, measured in the men who did not come back, and the men who came back carrying things they could not name, was accepted as a feature of the campaign, rather than a problem to be engineered away. The Ball turret gunner's position asked a very specific thing of the men who filled it. Not heroism in the conventional sense, not a charge across open ground or a decision made in a moment of crisis. It asked for a particular kind of sustained, quiet, non-dramatic courage. The willingness to climb into the turret on mission after mission, seal the hatch behind you, and operate at the end of a 2-minute parachute access chain in a space that offered no protection and no exit, above territory that wanted you dead. Most of them did it without making a significant event of having done it. They climbed in because their crew needed the guns, they climbed out because the mission was over, and they went back to the briefing room the next morning and prepared to do it again.